every time you've ever done something in your life, it's never been a case of I did it with complication, or I didn't do it, right? It's been like, let's say that I'm trying to persuade someone. There was that one sentence that I said that really resonated with them, but then I tried a different tactic and suddenly they were like, oh, shut the hell up, and I lost my footing. And when I think about how you describe the things that are happening after someone rolls that die, like the mechanics never really seem to map with that.
Welcome to the Draw Your Dice podcast, the show that calls on the champions and new contenders of the tabletop RPG arena. My name is Jeremy Gage, and I am learning about tabletop game design and publishing. If you are a budding game designer or a veteran looking for fresh musings, stay tuned as we learn about the inspirations, processes, and philosophies of professionals in the industry. Hello everyone, welcome to the Draw Your Dice podcast. My name is Jeremy Gage, as you heard in the intro, but today, as always, is never about me. It is always about the person I've brought. It's a great day. I've always had a celebrity on here with every episode, but particularly someone I've been watching for a long time. Got me in when I first got introduced to the Blades and the Darks and the Iron Sworns and all of the hullabaloos. They are video producer and journalist, game designer. You've seen him on Dicebreaker. You've seen him on Eurogamer. You've seen him on Outside Xbox. You've seen him on Total War. The YouTube, Twitch personality, Michael Whelan.
Hello. How's it going? Oh, the applause sound effects. You need to get yourself one of those soundboards, my friend.
I have a Foley career in the making.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for coming and invite me on.
Invite you on? I mean, I'm humbled that you are here. I am humbled that you are here. Absolutely. I'm reeling, actually. I just spent probably the last 20 minutes gushing with Wheels on here. Wheels, for the folks at home who may not be aware of who you are, would you just give a brief introduction of how you present yourself to the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am Wheels. A lot of people hear that and think my name is Will, but it's Wheels like on the bus, which is basically just short for my surname, which is Whelan. So I am, in general, I'm a video producer and a game designer. So I wear sort of two hats. On the video side, I am currently working as the head of video over at Dicebreaker.com, which is a very good website for the very nice people. We are sort of like a video game journalism site, but for board games instead. So we cover all kinds of tabletop RPGs, board game news, anything related with the hobbyist stuff like miniatures and painting and all that kind of thing. But the specific wing that I work on is on the YouTube channel, on youtube.com/Dicebreaker, where we do actual plays and like reviews and podcasts and all that kind of stuff that Jeremy apparently has been watching, which is good to hear. But then when I get home and I take off my work hat and I put on my slightly more like bedazzled streamer / game designer hat, I am just Wheels and on a couple of things in the background. So I've released two sort of very micro RPGs. So like one that's just like a 2-page kind of like comedy RPG about wizards called Wiz Nerds. One that is essentially like a solo journaling RPG that I wrote with my friend Zoe, which is called Would You Search Through the Lonely Earth for Me? Which, let me tell you, it's difficult to make URLs out of that bad boy. But recently, and very, very soon to be digitally released, I have been working on a game called The House Doesn't Always Win, which is the biggest solo project I've ever done. It is massive. I sent Jeremy a copy so he could have a little read through, which is very exciting. So looking forward to hearing what he has to say about that. But that is, if you go onto wheelsrpgs.com, that's all one word, then you can find The House Doesn't Always Win, which is my massive project about risk and revolution. It's a playing card driven RPG about social change and like taking down the people that oppress you and just sort of like really idealistic way of looking at how social change happens and maybe being a little bit more action movie oriented than the real world actually is. But yeah, apart from that, I stream on Twitch as well. I do too many things, basically.
You do all the things.
Always tired. I'm also on twitch.tv/ oh look, it's Wheels, where I do box standard Twitch stuff, but I also, play live music and do like stupid things like we read out Skyrim books the other week, just for the sake of it, like we were on an Audible. But yeah, that's all there, all wrapped in a weird, cursed 90s TV show aesthetic over on twitch.tv/OLucasWheels. And that is all the things that I do. Sorry about that. That's probably the longest intro you've ever had.
No, I've definitely had longer. But all in the best way. I love it. And it's worth noting all the important things that you do. Like, you provide a lot of content and ideas for people out in the world. So claps to you, Wheels. As always, the sword is like an additional icebreaker to the show. I always like to see the steps that it took someone to enter their game design headspace, if you will. So what sort of was the first game that you played tabletop wise? Could be a board game, could be an RPG, but what sort of like started really having you consume the discipline? And then what game, maybe a hack, you wrote a hack for it or a supplement for something, or what game really opened up your game design spectrum?
So I come from like a relatively like big family. So I'm the youngest of 4 brothers. So like, yeah, so my long suffering mum would would like, you know, often give us like tabletop stuff to play with. And I remember like being a young kid and playing like Risk over Christmas and stuff like that, and just really loving the like atmosphere of that. So it was always something that was kind of in the back of my head, and like we'd play like very classic board games when I was with my family. But around like one Christmas, I think when I was at like university, my brother got me a copy of Carcassonne, which is like a classic like intro board game. For those who don't know, it's like a sort of tile laying. It almost looks like a big puzzle of like a medieval city, but you like grab points based on where you put your little meeples and stuff. And that kind of introduced me to tabletops as a whole. From there, it was like a rat that got into your food. Like I just consumed everything I could see as fast as physically possible, and I've just been completely enamored of all tabletop stuff. As far as RPGs are concerned, though, I have been playing them since I was about 16, I think. I obviously started with D&D, which is what most people sort of like come into, because, you know, when you're first being introduced to the hobby, like, that's the only thing that exists, right? Like, what's an RPG? Oh, you mean Dungeons and Dragons? Got it. So that was very much like my sort of first foray into that. But I think without realizing it, like I was hungry for like the more indie RPG scene, and that's where I sort of started creating things. And I would just sort of, you know, like frustrated with how overly complicated that D&D seemed, I would just sort of, you know, make my own little RPGs, and I would sit on a Google Doc with my friends and just be like, you know, writing down skills and all that kind of stuff, and just hacking my way around it. So I've kind of been like unofficially designing games since I was a teenager. I never really saw myself as a game designer, but just sort of like did it for fun. And it was only when I got really sort of in depth in the industry and like seeing how it all ticks and like being exposed to lots of things through Dicebreaker, that I was just like, God, like I've been doing this for so long, like I should really just put something in like Photoshop and just shove it out there and just see what happens, right? Which is when I was just like, I've always had this idea where, so the first RPG I ever released publicly was not that long ago, it was like a year or two ago. It's called Whiz Nerds. It is like kind of a spoof of Harry Potter, and none of the money goes to a turf when you buy it, so that's good. But it's a game in which you have a very bog standard like D6 rolling system, but you have in the middle of the group this big word list split into 3 columns, and they're all like gobbledygook magic words. So, you know, there's like, you know, like you would have like Alakazam or anything like that. They're all just sort of either using the like default ones that are in the book, or the GM will just write loads of nonsense words that don't mean anything. But unbeknownst to the players, for the first time they play it, behind the scenes, the GM has like a translation list. So like one of those words might mean fire, and one of those words might mean like wave. One of those words might mean pointing and stuff like that. And the players at any point can combine one word from each of the 3 columns to make a spell, but they don't know what the spell does. So the whole idea is that they are magic students who have been forced into saving the world, but it's literally their first day of magic school, so they haven't learned anything yet. They've just got this big book of magic words they don't understand. So they read out a word and accidentally set their mate on fire, or I had one playthrough, and it was actually Zoe from Eurogamer, who I wrote the second RPG with. She cast a spell, and it's sort of like up to interpretation for the GM. So it's like, if you cast 3 spells, you look at the 3 words, and then the GM just sort of like thinks, okay, that's what this spell probably looks like. It was something like immunity to being solid. And I was like, oh, you've turned yourself into a ghost, but you don't have any way to propel yourself. So you're kind of just like sinking through the floor. And like, for some reason, she just couldn't figure out how to stop it. So she just spent most of the session just like being translucent and just slipping through objects and just like laughing out of frustration quite a lot, which is very, very funny. But yeah, so that was my first step into actually designing things. And then I became enamored with all the incredible solo like journaling RPGs like Gentleman Bandit by Alison Arth and The Machine by Adira and Fen Slattery, and just wanted to make my own. And it was with Zoe, and her favorite song is the song where that lyric comes from that sort of inspired the title. And it's written from the perspective of a treasure. So like a treasure that's been buried in the earth, and that is very like romanticized view of objects and stuff like that, which kind of inspired the idea. It's like, what if instead of being a character that finds a magical necklace, like what if you are that magical necklace and it gets passed between person to person after, like over hundreds of years, and it's one of those kind of like deep time games where things will pass like between moments that are like decades apart. And it's a very sort of like romantic and poetic game. Like it's one where you can be really kind of fluid and like writerly, which is quite fun. I think it's a very sort of, yeah, I guess romantic is the word for it. Like it's a very like a soft and lovely way of viewing the world, I think, which is nice at the moment. But in the background throughout all of that, I had these 2 big RPG ideas. There was one that would eventually become Theodore. There was also this one which is about skeletons and like what it's like to be a skeleton and what happens if your head falls off and all that kind of stupid stuff. But like, yeah, so like they just had these 2 ideas in the background, and there was just a moment where I was sort of like finally getting into building what would then eventually become The House Doesn't Always Win. And I think I was just playing it with some friends, and they were just sort of like so positive about it. I was like, oh, well, I should do something with this, you know, like I'm sure they would tell me if it's rubbish, right? Like I've got those kind of friends where like they're open and honest with me. Like they would tell me if it wasn't actually any good. So I started writing it, and with every page it just got a bit more ambitious and a bit more like, oh, what if I did this? And then eventually I just sat there and just thought to myself, should I crowdfund this? Like, should I give this absolutely every chance that it could have? And eventually I stopped finding reasons why I shouldn't. And a huge shout out to my dad, who is credited in the front of the book, who is an accountant and made sure that I didn't put myself in a position where I would bankrupt. But yeah, after that, launched the campaign, and that's where I am today. That is my journey into game design in a nutshell. But yeah.
Amazing. One, I also come from a very large family. There was a point in my life where I was living in a house of 3 families of like totaling 18 people. So I totally get the board game sort of every night situation, especially when I was a kid. So I love that. But when you're talking about Wiznerds, I thought about this really interesting thing you did where you kind of created a decoding game, right? Because they're playing like wizard students, right? So they don't know exactly what these spells do, but they can learn, right? And I think the reason I tap on that a little bit is when we get to talking about The House Doesn't Always Win, you have sort of these mechanics in there that have a layer of mastery to them. Like you can play the game like fun Willy Gonzo and like not think about it, but if you wanted to really like play with counting cards and realizing what's left in the deck and what your options are, like that's also there. So I find it interesting that both your first game and this iteration sort of have this subtle mastery level to it, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I personally am a big proponent of is there is not enough crossover between board game design and RPG design, because like you're making big like finally someone said it moments.
Yeah, it's so weird because I've been in like 3 different conversations because I'm a very like tactical RPG kind of person. Like I like certain things that D&D does, and I definitely like I definitely don't like things that it kind of skims over, like engaging role-playing mechanics and stuff like that. It's all very combat focused. And I was literally just talking with someone the other day where like tactically based RPGs need to stop taking from war games and really analyze like the board game space.
Yeah.
We were talking about like Devil May Cry Bloody Palace, that board game, and then we were also talking about the Dark Souls board game, which both execute those sort of requirements beautifully. So I just like, I'm freaking out that you said it.
Well, it's like, you know, I see so many board game designs where I'm just like, God, this would be a really interesting thing if it replaced like rolling a d20, you know, or this would be a really interesting thing if it replaced how experience points worked or something like that. And it's just, whenever I see a new RPG, I'm like, I can be quite cynical about it. And I'm sure there are things that I should have played where I haven't because I've like, you know, scoffed or whatever, which is completely on me. And I'm the only one who's missing out, really. But when I see a game and it's like, oh, I had this really wild idea, like I've got this crazy theme that nobody's thought of before, and I think it's going to be really interesting and really cool, and I'm fully on board with it. I'm like, yeah, that theme's amazing, that world's amazing, like that idea behind it is amazing. But then they say, and it's based on 5th edition D&D, and the rules are powered by the apocalypse, and it's like, oh, come on, like, because like I will always say this, like, there is not an RPG in the world where there isn't just a mechanic that could be married to it that makes it even better, and I'm way more interested in seeing a game that tries to do something new mechanically and then sees where the RPG like grows out of that. Because like whenever I'm designing something, I'm always designing the mechanic first and then thinking what would be interesting to explore based on this. So literally, like, thinking about Theodore and where that came from, I was sat there with a deck of playing cards just like thinking about things and thought, oh, what if, like, because, you know, it was very different at the start, obviously, as all things are. What if, you know, this deck of cards was like a group of people, and like, what if instead of rolling a die and you yourself, the one person character, does something, what if you draw a card and suddenly that character comes out to help? You know, like the 7 of clubs is a person and it comes out and it's good at this thing but bad at this thing, so if he turns up and tries to fix a problem, it depends on how good he is the problem's like solution to be able to see how well he can do that. And I started playing with that idea, and I thought about, you know, what happens if you remove an entire suit from the deck? And that became like, okay, the diamonds. So like, why are the diamonds out of the deck? Well, the diamonds, you know, maybe are like sort of the antagonists. Maybe they're like, you know, they're the diamonds, whereas everything else is just like a, you know, like a heart or a club or something like that. Like they're very ostentatious, and suddenly they became like, oh, what if they're like the sort of ruling class? And then it became about revolutions, and none of that. It wasn't like I sat down and I said, I want to write a game about revolutions. I sat down and I made a game and I realized it was about revolutions. You know, like it was already in the game. I just had to find it. If that doesn't sound too,
it super makes
tarot
sense
reading,
to me.
you know, yeah. But it's like there's every single mechanic in the world that has been invented and will be invented. There is an RPG that could be made from it, and I think I will always be drawn to those games rather than ones that are always about theme with mechanics that don't necessarily match. Because I think about, like, I think one RPG that was definitely like a really eye-opening thing for me and probably introduced me to, you know, like RPGs that aren't the big ones that everyone's heard of is 10 Candles which, yeah, like, as you can tell by Jeremy's reaction, is a fantastic game. And it's like, if you've not heard of it, it's a tragic horror RPG, and it has this really, really smart sort of like theatrical main mechanic, which is super easy to learn. I can teach you it right now. There are 10 candles in a circle in the middle of the room, and every time you fail a roll, so like the odds are massively in your favor at the start of the game, but every time you fail a roll, one of those candles goes out and you lose a die from your dice pool. So you start with 10 dice, a candle goes out, suddenly you've got 9, and failure becomes more of a thing, and like your time feels like it's running out, and like the game is played in pitch black, only lit by candlelight. So as you're playing it, you know, the candles go out and like the room is getting darker and the atmosphere is more tense and oppressive, and you're more likely to fail with every single thing that you have to do. And there's one piece of shared information that no matter what setting you're playing in, no matter what characters you have, no matter what story you're trying to tell, there is one thing that's always true, and it's that at the end of the game,
all the characters will die. And it's tragic horror, right? And it's like, there are some people who just do not like that. They're like, you mean I can't win?
Yeah, I can't win RPGs.
Yeah, it's like there was a genuine comment I had because there's a similar game called, a similar idea, a game called Icarus, which is, I should say, like a friend of mine, Spencer Stark, wrote it. Although he wasn't my friend when I reviewed it, he became my friend after the review because like I just had to meet this guy because he was clearly a genius. But yeah, I sort of wrote this review of like how much I love Icarus. It's fantastic design about how like empires collapse and stuff like that, and how like civilizations fall away. And there was just this guy in the comments who was just like, it seems a bit stupid to have a game that you can't win. And I was like, oh man, like
I'm already passing out.
Yeah, I know. It's just like, it feels like, and people can play games however they like. And if that's the kind of game that interests that way, then that's absolutely fine. But you have to at some point try a game that isn't about winning. Like it's about telling a story and doing something interesting and like experiencing a world together and all that kind of stuff.
Or just don't punch down on something that like you don't enjoy, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, exactly that. But that's YouTube for you, isn't it? Yeah. But yeah, so like 10 Candles, like the one thing that everyone knows is that they're all going to die at the end. And it seems like a sort of, when you first hear that, like depending on your sort of outlook on things, you might be like, oh God, that sounds depressing. Or like, oh, like what's the point then? Like, you know, what do I do with my character? But it is the most liberating thing I've ever had, honestly, because like knowing that your character has an ending and we're all just working towards it, knowing what that ending is, and like knowing the things that are going to be important to your character now, because like your character's going to die, and if they've kind of got that in the back of their head in world as well, because like the setting of 10 Candles is like super apocalyptic, like everyone knows they're kind of screwed, right? So if they've got that in the back of their head, like what becomes important to that character now? It's less like I want to level up and get a new skill. It's like, God, did I live a good life? Do I want to try and do more good in the world? Or like there's this other character in the group and, you know, maybe there's like a romantic bond forming or something like that. And it's like, is this a good idea? Should I get into a romance in a cursed world? Like, all of those questions become so much more interesting and so much more personal. And suddenly characters that are only defined by like 4, like not even traits or like stats, but just sort of like ideas. You know, maybe they're a struggling alcoholic with a real love for poetry, and you know they have that vice, but they also have like some really genuine, lovely qualities to them, and they're just someone who has struggled at points. Suddenly that character becomes so much more real, so much more tangible, and it's all just through real mechanical ideas, like real tangible things that you can interact with in the game. It's not just a thematic wrapper around rolling a d20 and hoping to get a number. It's like everything in that game serves one purpose, and that's to tell the exact specific story that Stephen was trying to tell. And I think that is just such a wonderfully beautiful thing, and it's like it's something that's so unique to RPGs in my mind, especially ones that are designed by like a single person, because they are just so all-encompassingly like pushing towards that same ideal, that same like objective. Because you like play like a massive AAA video game and you've got 400 different ideas, and some of them are just sort of like in there because they feel like they have to be. Some of them are in there because one person on the team really liked them, whereas the other didn't. And you can see that kind of clash between the sort of like objectives that they all had, like the story they were trying to tell, the game they were trying to make. Whereas you've got these solo projects, you know, you look at something like Undertale, all written by one person, every single bit, the art, the music, the game design, the mechanics, the story, everything all made by one person, sorry. And it's like every single thing in that game just serves that one purpose of trying to tell the story that person was trying to tell. And when you write RPGs, like, there's so many barriers that get taken down. There's so much less technical knowledge that you need to have. There's so much less like minimum requirements for you to release the game that you're trying to release. So it's way more welcoming to someone to be like a solo designer. And you can get, you know, like I have done, you can get other writers who you think would be good to work on that. And you can get other artists, but you can absolutely just put everything into it and just tell the story that you're trying to tell. And I think it's almost, and I don't want to say it's a waste, because like there is nothing that has been created by someone who loved what they're creating that isn't good, right? For, it deserves to exist, all of it. But I do think that, if you're listening to this podcast and thinking, I want to write a game, you should think about what you're trying to achieve that game, or like think about what small moment or small idea or small story that you want to convey to the person who ends up playing it, and just think, is everything I'm putting in this game serving that purpose? Or is there something that is just sort of there to prop it up, or is just sort of there to, to sort of like give a bit of a driving force to something else in the story without actually really contributing to it? And think, is that how you want the game to be, or is that something to readdress and think about how to change? But yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely who said, I can't remember who told me about it, but Dira Slattery, who you mentioned earlier for The Machine, and I've had on the podcast prior, she talks about how there are explicit and implicit mechanics, and explicit mechanics are everything that is like rules or rolling dice or anything that's mechanically bound. And then implicit mechanics are the verbiage, the word choice that you use in the narrative to help distinguish your setting, but also informs the sort of story you're telling. And when you talk about designing from mechanic first, right? Thinking of a theme and then thinking about how do the mechanics serve that. I find that so interesting to point out, because there is definitely something for like the common example I'll always use on the show is D&D, right? I think that D&D relies heavily on its implicit materials, so like setting, adventure books, whatever have you, to help you provide a story at your table. I think that it's a game that doesn't, like, if you wiped away the words of the races, or if you wiped away the words of the classes and just had like these strict mechanical things, they don't have you serve a story. They just tell you how to operate the game. They tell you how to operate the machine, but they don't tell you where to go. And I think for me, I'm in agreement with you that there are way more powerful games, way more resonant games when you try to tie those things all together with how you engage the engine of the machine, of the game. And when you bring up 10 Candles, it's like, when you think about the horror genre, you can't tell someone to be scared. You can't like insert a jump scare into your prose and then be like, ooh, you're scared now. Like, that's not going to happen. And I think what 10 Candles does really well is it plays on the two big things of horror. One is atmosphere. You create a dark lit space, dimly lit. The light's playing tricks on you as the candles flicker in the space, right? And then the other thing is time. Like, those candles, whether they're in your control or not, are gonna go. Like, they're not in your control. They're going to go out at some point, right? And
which, by the way, is one of my favorite things I've read in that rule book. And I don't think we touched on that, but like, so not only do you put out a candle when you fail a roll, but if a candle just goes out, you have essentially failed a roll. So not only have you got like the drama of like, oh, it's getting darker, but if you talk too vigorously, your breath might blow out the one thing that's keeping your characters alive, and that immediately, the entire room is just immediately tense. They're like, they are in the shoes of their character. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just absolutely love that.
It's so good,
and that I think, that's exactly an example of something that is just, it's built to create the atmosphere that it's trying to push the people into. Whereas, as you say, with D&D, like it's a game about dungeon crawling, right? And there are all these grandiose sort of like wrappers of like, go to town and fall in love with someone and buy great treasures and form a guild and all this stuff. And it's like, they've added like little mechanical bits of like how you might do those things. But then a lot of it is, as you say, it's like it's implied. There's no real mechanical like help for you to do that, to tell those stories.
Yeah, there's all the heavy lifting is done by the players when it comes to the role play, which I think adds to some of the fake versatility of the game. And I think it's important as I move forward with this podcast, I'm not trying to dunk on anyone that likes D&D 5e. I think that it's a game like every other game. It's not for me, but I'm not here to punch you out if you like D&D. But it definitely doesn't help you role play. It just tells you whether you succeed or not at doing a thing, and then you make it up from there. There's no mechanics really in the game that help you delineate, like, Exactly like you said, like how to build a guild if you start your own guild, right? Or how to make a guild. What does a guild do? You have to come up with all that, do your own personal historical research, and then add all those things to the game, or look up
or
someone
buy,
else's third-party supplement.
Yeah, buy a $30 supplement from Wizards or something, that will give you some kind of help. But
Yeah.
But also just like, like as you said, like every game has its purpose, and D&D has a purpose. It's playing a fantasy hero who can fight goblins and level up and get skills, and like, everything in D&D is kind of in service to the combat, which is why I think sometimes you'll often find that like if you do want to have those non-combat encounters that are fun and like silly and goofy and interesting and like maybe quite tense and quite fun to follow along with, you need the players to really push outside of the restrictions of the rule set and take things like a little bit, like just sort of like be a bit loose with the interpretations of how things are supposed to work, and introduce new things that just aren't really supported in the rule set, which I think is why a lot of people who are invested in RPGs as a whole rather than sort of Dungeons and Dragons on its own can get quite frustrated with people who sort of like evangelize D&D. It's not like a sort of, oh, you're an idiot for playing D&D. It's like, no, like if you want to play a dungeon crawl, absolutely. Like, and there's other games that will do that as well in different ways. But it's when you see like a story from someone that's like, oh, we were playing D&D last night and like we didn't even do any fighting or anything. We just got like really invested in these side characters in it, and like it turned into like a dating sim or something. It's like, okay, cool, man, but like there are RPGs that do that. Like if that was what's interesting to you, if that's the thing that you come out of your session and you remember fondly, and you completely forget the 4 hours that you spent waiting for your turn in the initiative run so that you can cast your one cantrip that you always cast and then move on with your life, like maybe stop doing those bits and look at some of the RPGs that focus on storytelling and focus on romance, or focus on like stealth, or focus on like interesting ways to cast magic or rituals or anything like that, because all of those things are available in a way that is going to actually help you to tell those stories. And when you've got that help, let me tell you, the stories get so much better. You think about, and like we spoke about Blades in the Dark of the actual play series, like a fantastic game. John Harper's like a legend in the space. He's like definitely someone who is always thinking of like making complete games, like I said, right? Like Blades in the Dark, there is absolutely nothing in that game that doesn't serve the fantasy of being like a sort of roguish character in a dark and gritty world. And if you play like a rogue in D&D, like there are mechanical things that support you and stuff like that, but like you can see the rules kind of creak where it's like, how does stealth work in D&D? Well, you roll stealth and you either fail or you succeed. And you might have a skill that helps you roll it. Or, if you attack someone from stealth, you'll get a little bonus. But then outside of that, like it becomes a little bit shallow. It's just sort of like, oh, well, those stealth attacks, they work better if someone's already fighting the creature, right? So now you're part of the combat, and that makes more sense, right? Because everyone's supposed to be just hitting things. Yeah. So if someone's hitting things and you hit them, then that's stealth. And it's like, not really. Not really. Yeah. But it's like with Blades in the Dark, a game that is all about like being like a huckster or a charlatan, or like, a rogue or a cat burglar or anything like that. Everything is in service to that. There's like special gear on your character that only you can have based on the kind of character that you are. And it's not necessarily like you get +2 to stealth. It's like, hey, this is a thing and this is what it does in the world. You try and think of like why that's useful, why that's good for you, why that's going to serve what you want to do. So, like, for example, you might have a charm that wards away ghosts. You might have a mask that lets you see ghosts. And let me tell you, that's one of the more interesting characters. You might have, like, a pet companion, and they might have, like, a special supernatural power. Like, they could have supernatural speed, or you could have a mind link with them. What if you have a lynx that can, like, follow your commands from 40 meters away? How is that now more interesting in a stealth setting? Like, can you use them for distractions, or should you use them for scouting? Like, all that kind of stuff. And then each character is, because it, like, Blades in the Dark is kind of like a game where you're all you're all playing rogues, but kind of subclasses. Like you've got the assassin, you've got the person who you never see, like the shadow. You've got like the sniper who kills you from 400 meters away. You've got like everything, right? And like when you look at the bare bones of those mechanics, and you strip away all the setting, and you just look at how does this mechanic work, everything's in service to that. So you can see bits where other RPGs have inspired it. So there's the clock system, which I think is from Apocalypse World, which is essentially like you draw a circle, you cut it into segments, and then you can fill it up when things happen. So, you know, John Harper sees that idea and implements it into the game, but it's like suddenly it becomes like awareness meters and like how long until the guards find that body that you left somewhere. And suddenly it's that moment of like, I know that if we keep pushing this, eventually something's going to crack, and that alarm state is going to trigger that we've all got in like a stealth video game where you've been playing Metal Gear Solid, and suddenly it's like dun dun dun. You know, like it's you get like everyone knows that moment because that is like, you know, video games have been doing stealth for a long time, and there's like a whole language on that. And John Harper makes no secret that that game is inspired by Dishonored, like which is a very very popular stealth video game, which is very good and you should play it. And it's like everything that you strip away everything else that surrounds that mechanic and you look at it, you're like, oh no, that still makes sense.
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Yeah,
that still is delivering on the promise. And you know, maybe there'll be ones that don't make quite as much sense, but then you combine it with one other and you're like, oh, I see, you've completely reimagined how that works and made it something different because it serves the narrative that you're trying to push.
Exactly. I think we're kindred spirits in this space.
I'm glad.
Yeah. But I don't want this to be... those are great tips. In fact, I think it's flip the head. This will be our TLDR tip that people could listen to first, which is great because let's try a new format of the show. Why not? I've read the game. I will do a bad job at introducing it. Why don't you talk about what the House Doesn't Always Win is about?
Okay, so the tagline for the House Doesn't Always Win is it's a game of risk and revolution. So like the imagery that I'm trying to draw upon and like the thing that I want you to think about is imagine you're in a world, and it won't be too difficult to imagine when I start describing it because it sounds an awful lot like ours, where there is a small group of people who control all the power, and then there's everyone else who's left with nothing, right? Whether that is, you know, like this is a settingless RPG, so it's a system rather than like a world. So you could play that in like Les Mis style revolutionary France, or you could play that as, you know, space truckers who are desperately trying to form a union and get rid of the horrible corporation that runs their toll booths or whatever. You could be members of some ancient family who only sort of like, you know, live amongst themselves and like everyone who joins the family never leaves again. And you want to be the head of that family. You know, sometimes you might be characters that don't actually have motives that are good. You know, maybe you're actually trying to take power for yourself and not give it to everyone else. Maybe you've seen people in power and think, yeah, I want that for myself. Maybe you're mobsters in the 1920s and you're like trying to be the next big family or something like that. But that's like the central conflict. You know, you've got nothing, they've got everything, and you want to reverse that. Mm-hmm. Whether when you're in that position you share out the wealth or whatever is up to you. But then the sort of mechanics that feeds that and the way that you interact with that idea. And the reason it's called The House Doesn't Always Win is because it's all about gambling, and it's all about taking a risk on something that the odds are so low that it's going to happen, but you know that if you just give it a try and if it just all goes exactly how you want it to, like you could completely change your lives for the better, and maybe everyone else's as well. So it's a game that draws on things like poker, 21, or blackjack on like that idea of like pushing your luck and thinking, if I just keep going, I know that the odds against me. If I just draw one more card, then maybe this will be it. And knowing that, like, you know, that idea, that title, The House Doesn't Always Win, like the phrase is the house always wins, right? But that's not always true, right? There are those 1% of people that win big, and like just that hope that it could be you, you know? That's everything in that system. So it's a game in which you play with a standard deck of playing cards. As I said before, the diamonds get removed from the deck and they represent your antagonists. They're called the diamonds in the book, but they could be CEOs of a mega company, or, you know, an evil tyrant king, or anything that sort of like fits the theme that you're in. And you're going to go through 3 missions, which are, I mean, kind of inspired by things like Dishonored, things like Hitman, where you've got like one target that you're trying to take down. They have their defenses set up. They're in their sort of like ideal location, or you've picked somewhere that, you know, you've got a unique opportunity, and you're going to use a blend of all of your skills of like cunning and social stealth and real stealth and, you know, masterminding schemes and Rube Goldberg machines and whatever it takes to get to that target and to deal with them in whatever way you see fit. So it's a game in which you're all sort of like collaboratively trying to solve this puzzle of how do you take down someone who's untouchable, right? And it's a game that can be completely non-violent if you like. Like, you could spend your entire time just communicating with people and trying to get to the right place, and then finally like talking down the villain and making them see the error of their ways without throwing a single punch or shooting a single gun. But equally, it could be an absolute bloodbath. You know, it could be a real Hitman 3 where you don't care about any of the bonuses. You are like just shooting down everyone you can find. You get there and then you get the guillotine out, like whatever it is that you see fit as how to deal with this sort of problem that you've been faced with. And it all collides in these 3 grand sweeping missions where you're taking down the Jack, the Queen, and the King of Diamonds. And once you do that, if you manage to get all the way there without everything crumbling underneath you, how does the world now change now that you've done that? And sort of like imagining the world that you've now put yourselves in. And that is the House Doesn't Always Win in a nutshell. Like, that's, without going into any of the mechanical details, that is like the central message that I'm trying to push, which hopefully, as we now talk about the mechanics, you will see.
Yeah, I had an absolute ball reading through this book. The mechanics are very cool, detailed, but I mean that in the best of ways. Like, there's definitely a lot of things to consider, even with something as simple as drawing a card or keeping a hand of cards. Like, there's so many ways to execute on narrative ideas. And what I'm becoming more and more fascinated by as I meet more and more designers is, you know, my first game was D&D, and I'm used to thinking about, man, how can I get this campaign wrapped up in 12 months? You know what I mean? Like, that sort of concept. Whereas this, it's like 3 sessions and you do a whole campaign, and you even have blurbs in the book about how, hey, if your campaign failed, or even if it succeeded, if you wanted to continue in this space that you created, you're more than welcome to roll up new characters and explore the setting like years later, months later, or whatever have you. Use the same characters and see if there aren't other versions of the diamonds. Like, instead of being on the high rung, maybe there's someone who's challenging you for power in the same space. Maybe one of your previous friends goes rogue, and now you're sort of dealing with that, right? So it has this very versatile game length feel. Great for one shots, great for short campaigns, great for long campaigns if you really want to put the effort in there. And it's also very setting agnostic, as you put it in the book. And I don't know if these are, I didn't get a chance to look at the Kickstarter page, but I don't know if these were stretch goals, but there are a bunch of beautiful adventures and settings in the back of the book provided by other freelance designers that tell a whole myriad of different stories, which are very, very cool that you supplied that in the book. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, so those were stretch goals, so they were all sort of like collaborators. I do want to give a massive shout out to Adira Slattery, who you mentioned earlier, who, like, I wanted to make sure there was a diverse cast in the book, and she had, like, she is very much ingrained in the RPG world, where I feel like I'm still a beginner, so she knows all the people to talk to. So yeah, exactly right.
Yeah,
so, like,
I feel the same way.
Yeah, it was great to have someone, because, like, and I was very much like, I know this sounds stupid, but because you talked about how, like, oh, you're having a celebrity moment or whatever, I'm like, my heart's beating like 100 points a minute, because I'm talking about myself. Like, when I'm on video and I'm just someone from Dicebreaker, or I'm giving an interview or whatever, like, it's water off a duck's back. Like, I've been doing video for so long, I barely even notice it anymore. Like, I can stand in front of 1,000 people in a room and talk about a video game and, like, barely even notice it. As soon as I'm, like, talking about something I care about and, like, something that's me, I'm like, oh god, I'm so nervous. Like, I don't know what to talk about. So, like, the idea of reaching out to collaborate with people, and, you know, even people who might not think they have a big following themselves, like I see and I think, oh wow, like they've made these incredible games, and like you know maybe like they've only sold 100 copies, but I just think they're really cool, and like if I reach out, are they just gonna be like, who the hell are you, like. So I had this kind of like dilemma where I was like, oh god, like I want to reach out to all these great creators, and I want to make sure that like I'm reaching out to people from all different backgrounds, because like especially with the kind of setting that this game has, like if I wrote a game about social change and every single person who worked on it was like a white bloke, like I would not be happy with myself, you know what I mean? Like it's not, whilst I think like everyone has a responsibility, like there's also, I think there are people in the world where it's like it's way more important to them because it has to be, and like to deprive them of a chance to be a voice on that would be like a really bad move on my part. So like Dira was absolutely massive in like pointing me in the right direction of people who would be like a great fit, and like I'm really glad that she did, because some of the like scenarios, like I don't know how many of them were in the book when you got the preview link and like you got to read, but some of them are so cool.
So cool.
They're so
cool.
good.
I think there's like 6 back here.
Yeah, so there's 9 in total. So I wrote 3 of them, and then there were, like we didn't hit every single stretch goal, so there were other people that could have got involved. But so to give you like a sort of sample, Zalavar Nelson Jr., who is absolutely hilarious. He is the writer on games that are coming out recently, one of which is called An Airport for Aliens Currently Run by Dogs. Also Hypnospace Outlaw, which is a really great game. He's also writing on Skatebird and like loads of really cool, like really out there indie projects. But he has written a scenario in which you take down Santa Claus, which is genuinely the funniest thing. Like it's like, Santa Claus is a horrendous cannibal and is like fueled by dark magic, and like all of the elves are in this horrible post-apocalyptic nightmare, and you're trying to take him down, and it's absolutely fantastic. There's also, so I've written like cyberpunk scenario and a medieval scenario and like a mobster scenario, so like really sort of like flatline things. But we've got pirate scenario by Spencer Stark. We've got like a gothic mansion scenario by Zoe Delahunty Light. We've got Attacking and Dethroning God by Johnny Chiodini. We've got like weapons, like living weapons turning against their creator. Like so many amazing things that like are in that book, all because of those fantastic creators. So, and again, a massive shout out to Adira for pointing me into the right direction of those people, because they've all written some really, really cool stuff. And there's ones that I haven't mentioned yet, but I mean, go buy the book and see them for yourself, I guess.
Exactly. Support. No, they're great, and they're really eye-opening to all the different ways you could push on the setting. I even, like, as I was reading the book, I thought about different... I'm not a great, like, world builder, to be perfectly honest. I always let my players do that for me. But I think about all the different games with very, like, specific settings. Or even, I think I really am attracted to Magic the Gathering's planes, like the different lore planes that they make in those. And so I immediately was like, oh, like who would be my Jack, who'd be my Queen, who'd be my King, what would be the hierarchy like? Like it's all good. It's all great.
Yeah, it's very like, and it's designed in I call it a zero prep game, and like obviously there's rules to learn, but like provided you know how the game works, you can sit down, create a character, and create a world completely from scratch and play it in like literally about half an hour and start playing. Like it's built to be really robust with how much like you can create in such a short period of time, because all the world can just be completely invented through play, right? Like there's no burden of like, okay, well, what how does magic work in this world or anything like that, because it's like there's nothing in the rule set that is explicitly world building. It's all built to work in literally any setting that you want. So you can just be like, okay, well, we all know this world, right? Like we all know Lord of the Rings. We're in that world now. Bam. Like immediately. Here's the 3 characters you're going after. Here's who you lot are. Done. Like,
yeah, let's go.
The King of Diamonds is Sauron. There you go. Done. Easy. Like, but yeah, like, so that was something that was quite important to me. So, and I'll tell you, like, I've said that 3 times now. I don't know why that's become my new phrase, but I'll tell you, the writing of a game which has no setting is a really interesting challenge, because you can't explicitly imply anything in the text. Like just there was a real moment where like I didn't want to call it a revolution if in every setting, because like sometimes it's not, right? Like in that mobster scenario that I've written, you're not forming a revolution, you're doing a hostile takeover, right? And it still works, but like there's still that idea of the people on the bottom taking over the people on the top. So like, just having language that sort of is all encompassing like that was also really different and difficult to work with. But I think we've done a huge shout out to the editor, Lauren, who has just completely made that 100 times better than it ever would have been if I was just writing it myself. But yeah, that's something that's like, you'll never read a chapter of the book and think, oh, well, how the hell does that work with my saying? Like, and that was an important part of it, I think.
Well executed as well, for sure. Well, let's dive into some of like we could talk about every mechanic in this game for the next 4 hours, but I think we'll talk about some more like inspirations for this thing and like what was your intent here, right? Some like designer footnotes, like director's commentary type stuff. But definitely go get the game. It is powerful. I highly recommend it. I don't know if that means anything to anyone, but Jeremy, tell him Jeremy sent you. But
yeah, so like, well, I guess like, shall I give like a broad like overview of how the mechanics like work, I guess, in like a sort of 5 minute.
Yeah, like what do the suits mean? The D10 that's in there. Let's talk about sort of the setup. When you're setting the game up.
So you start with your deck of cards, and your deck of cards is the most important thing in the entire game, right? Everything in that game is driven by that deck of cards. You take the diamonds out; those are your antagonists. All of the number diamond cards, they're kind of like weak points that the diamonds have that you might be able to exploit, right? So you find out about some kind of dodgy trade deal that, high-level diplomat has made that if it came out would be really dangerous for him. If you manage to get that info, that's a weak point, and suddenly that becomes like a powerful card in your deck, and you get to take that for yourself. But in the rest of the deck, of course, you've got the clubs, the hearts, and the spades. And this is kind of like the trichotomy of the settings. So pardon me, everyone who isn't a diamond is in one of those sort of like categories. And it's basically the way in which you interact with the world. So if you are a person who is quite brash and resistant and is good at like athletics and intimidation and fighting and like physical strength and all that kind of thing, you might be a club. Whereas if you're really sort of deductive or like good at sort of like social cues and empathy and manipulation and trying to read people and all that kind of thing, you might be a heart. And finally, if you're good at sort of like acrobatics and being sort of like lithe and quite sort of like cool and calm and like stealthy, exactly, Jeremy, just like yourself, then you might be a spade, and like that is kind of like the way that a lot of the game frames itself around, because to do anything in the game, instead of rolling a die like you would for D&D, so say I wanted to persuade someone to drop their gun because I'm not a threat, I might roll persuasion. And in D&D and in a lot of games, that sort of like, well, that the way that you break down that action happens in about 5 seconds. You pick up a D20, you roll it, and you either get the number that you need or you don't. And that, for me, always feels a little bit like anticlimactic because it's always like a binary yes or no. Some RPGs have come in and added like levels of success instead. So, for example, like Apocalypse World, which I talked about earlier, is a really popular one. Suddenly, a 6 or lower is a fail and a 10 or higher is a success. But what about 7 to 9? Well, that's like a partial success. So, that's got complications. And that makes it a little bit more interesting. But for me, like, every time you've ever done something in your life, it's never been a case of I did it with complication, or I didn't do it, right? It's been like, let's say that I'm trying to persuade someone. There was that one sentence that I said that really resonated with them, but then I tried a different tactic and suddenly they were like, oh, shut the hell up, and I lost my footing. And then there was that moment where, like I looked to my side and I realized that my friend was readying to grab their gun, and I just sort of like calmed them down, and that broke the tension in the room and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking as if I've ever been in a gunpoint situation. I've not. But, like when I think about how you describe the things that are happening after someone rolls that die, like the mechanics never really seem to map with that. So the way it works in this game, instead, you've got your target number that you're trying to get, but instead of rolling a die or drawing a card and looking at the result, instead you're trying to match the suit to a number of times. So let's say that we're in the same scenario. There's someone with a gun held at you, they're about to shoot, and you're trying to talk them down.
And I say, okay, that is going to be a hearts 3 challenge, which means that you need to draw 3 hearts for that to succeed. So the way that works is you've got your deck, it's all shuffled up, it's full of all the clubs, spades, and hearts in a standard deck of cards. So you've got like 13 of each, and you draw a card and you see what it is. So first one might be a heart, fantastic. You draw another card, okay, that's a spade. So that doesn't match, so not great, but you keep drawing and, okay, you've got another club, you've got another spade. And the binary is, if you manage to get all 3, you've succeeded. If you happen to draw 4 cards that don't match the suit before you do the number that you're trying to get the do, you failed. The in-between and that sort of like partial success that people talk about is already implicit in the cards, because sometimes you might have a challenge where you draw 3 hearts in a row, bang, did it. Like, that is a very easy thing to describe. You're like, oh, you've just like completely, whatever it is that you said, it must have resonated with them, because it's like they started holding their hands up. Like, you could just completely reverse the situation. Whereas if you had like a really desperate moment where you drew 3 spades in a row and you're like, oh God, I haven't got a single heart. And then all of a sudden you pull out the bag and you get the 3 hearts in a row. That's a very different situation, right? That suddenly the GM can look at that and think, oh, okay, right, so you were really going down the wrong path, and he was literally about to squeeze the trigger, but then you said one word and it just caught him, caught him by the ear, and it was like, there was that moment where it was like, okay, maybe I shouldn't do this. Like, you triggered his empathy. The final thing and the most important thing in the game, the thing that makes it what it is you have a third option whenever you're drawing. So there's failure, there's success, but there's not just partial success, but folding. And this is, so imagine you've just rolled your D20 and it's spinning on the table, right? And it's one of those moments where you're like, oh, you're in agony because you can't see the number, but it won't land. But what if there was a moment there where you could just be like, no, I pull out. I haven't seen the number yet. I stop. I stop the action. And that's kind of how the fold works. So let's say that you're in that previous scenario. You've drawn one of the hearts that you need, but you've drawn like 3 spades, and the next card you draw will either mean that you fail, or you haven't succeeded, but you're 2 out of 3, and you're like, God, that's bad odds. That's a moment where you can fold, and folding is essentially like, it's like a tantalizing thing that's always in the back of your head, and it's like, oh God, like it's not worth failing, because the penalties of failure are pretty harsh. So there's always that. You're always weighing up that decision as you move. So like every single sentence that you say to that guard who's about to pull the trigger, you're just like, do I just pull out here? Because I might make him even more annoyed. Like I might get myself in an even worse situation. Hell, he might even shoot me. And that is a thing that that have you got the guts to pull through the thing that you're trying to do? That is something that occurs in any kind of tense situation for any person, right? If you're trying to scale a building and you're halfway up and you get that classic movie moment where a bit of rock and you like pulls away from the building and you've got like one hand and you're looking down at the drop. Most people will in that situation in a film push on, but you've got the question yourself like, what happens if I do fall? Maybe I should just get back down again. Maybe we should look at another path. And the reason that folding is so important is because if you fail in this game, every single card that you drew is taken out of the game for the rest of the session. So if you drew 3 spades and then drew a club and you didn't get any of the hearts you needed, suddenly your odds of drawing a spade or a club in challenges that are about to come up, in challenges to come, have permanently dropped, because like the odds of the deck suddenly, one, you don't know them anymore. It was a third. Now you have to make a complicated maths equation every time you draw a card, which like the idea is that you're not supposed to, although I'm sure some people will.
I absolutely will.
But also it's just that idea of like, oh God, like now we have to change our tactics, because what was a 1 in 3rd chance of doing anything is now like, a sort of a 1/2 chance of talking to people, but only a
quarter chance of being able to beat people up or sneak past them, right? So suddenly, like if you've got a character's full of punchers and stealthers, then you're screwed, right? Suddenly you're going to have to start putting on your social graces. So you have to, like, the odds are forever changing in ways that you can never truly understand, but you have an idea of how they're changing, right? You've seen how many hearts you've already drawn and how many in the discard pile, so you know that you're running out of attempts to use that. Pardon me. You've seen all of the cards that you've taken out of the game, so you know that there are implicitly, like, cards that are just not going to come up again until you start the next session. So that is always like an equation that you're pulling, and it makes those actions, to me anyway, and to the players that I've played with, and I hope to the people who pick up the game, it makes those actions as tense in real life as they are in the game. And that is the big thing for me. Like, it is full of those moments of, like, difficult decisions made in split seconds, elongated into these long, like, anime fight scenes where it's like, you know, they've only thrown 3 punches, but it's got 30 minutes of screen time. Yeah. Like, it's
but every punch mattered.
Yeah, it's like, God, do I draw that extra card? Do I? And one thing that and this is the final mechanic that I'll talk, just to give you an idea of how it works, like, on a base level. Like, this is, if you stripped out all of the, you know, like the playbooks and all that kind of stuff, like, this is like the core of the system, and this is a system that you can use for your games as well. Like, there's a whole webpage that I've set up. If you want to make your own games, it's called Members of the House. If you want to make a game that's not powered by the apocalypse but is a member of the house, go ahead. And this is like the core that you need to understand. Every character that you play in the game is represented by a card in the deck. So if I want to be like a person who is always pushing their luck and, like, is just sort of hoping for the best and going in blind and stuff, I might play a Jack, because that's the kind of playbook that's good for that. And if I want to be like a stealthy character, or like a character who's really acrobatic and really good at scaling things, then I might be a Spade. So I play the Jack of Spades. That is my character. Nobody else is the Jack of Spades. And if the Jack of Spades goes, like, nobody else can be the Jack of Spades for the rest of the campaign. Because if you draw that card as part of your run of cards, then 2 things will happen. Like, one, either or. Either you were trying to find spades, and congratulations, you've critically succeeded because, you know, drawing a picture card of the same suit is a crit. Or you've drawn it when you were actually looking for one of the other suits. So that you're trying to draw clubs, but you accidentally drew the Jack of Spades. Now that's sitting there. And remember what I said? If you fail, all those cards are gone. So they all get taken out, which means that, you know, originally when I first wrote the game, it's been slightly rejigged so that you've got a few more chances, but that character's dead. Because those are the stakes, right? If your Jack is, like, part of the group and they're sort of, like, stood next to you as you're trying to talk down this gunman, and you fail and you see the gunman, like, raise the gun just about to take a shot, and the Jack of Spades dodges in front of you to try and stop the shot, and bam, just like that, they're gone. Like, they take the bullet. That is at all times, that is the level of risk that your characters are in. They're always just one failure away from being exposed, being attacked, being, like, completely thrown off guard or put in a terrible situation. Like, there's always that chance that something really bad can happen, and that hangs over you throughout the game. And that's the kind of oppressive atmosphere that the Diamonds have created in this kind of society that you're playing in. And that's why the mechanics enforce that. So it's like, you are always weighing up with every single card that you draw from the deck. You're always weighing up, okay, so we need to succeed at this challenge. However, there's a lot of hearts in here, and we're running out of heart cards. What happens if we run out of all the heart cards? We'll never be able to do a heart challenge for the rest of this mission. My friend's character is currently on the line. If I screw up this challenge, they're going to take damage. So, you know, like, as it's been reworked, you can take 3 hits, essentially. But every time you take a hit, your character gets permanently worsened. So, like, one of your stats is permanently worsened for the rest of the game. Will I maybe even draw a character card with the last card of the game? What happens if you fail, but the card that you drew was one of the character cards, and, like, without even knowing it, you've damaged someone without even weighing it up? But then there's always, and this is my favorite part of the game, there is always that moment where it seems impossible and someone goes, but what if we did try though? And there is just this elation where, and I'll tell you one example. For example, someone is trying to take down one of their targets, right? And they're trying to convince them to join their side, and like they're on their last legs. And this is a real story from playtest, that we're playing the mobster scenario. They've got this sort of like Jack of Diamonds character who's like maybe a little bit disillusioned with the rest of the diamonds, and you think maybe you could sway them onto your side and sort of like have a bit of a turncoat in them. And you've drawn 3 like spades and clubs when you're trying to draw hearts, and everything's going terrible. And because it's a really difficult challenge, you need to draw 4 hearts, and everyone around the table is, oh god, we're screwed. And like everyone's looking at the person doing the challenge. They're like, you're going to fold, right? And they're like, I've got a hunch. You know that feeling?
I'm here for it.
I've just got this hunch. And let me tell you, they drew their own character cards, the Jack of Hearts, and like critically succeeded at a challenge. If you crit with your own character as well, there's like an extra level of critical success, which is great. It's affectionately called the mega crit, but it's it's a critical triumph in the book. But just the whole room just erupted into cheers, and when that happens in a game you've written, I wanted to cry with happiness. Like it was just like one of the best moments I've ever had. And it's just, that's the kind of like stakes I want you to feel whenever you do something, right? It's not just, well, I hope this die roll goes good. You know, you were in charge of every single decision every time you drew one of those cards, and if it came out on top, you feel like the king of the world. And if you screw it up, oh boy. And everyone else is going to be looking at you, because remember, you're sharing that deck of cards because you've worsened everyone's odds, not just your own. Yeah, it's a game that like it's taken a lot of tweaking to get it exactly where I want it. And as you said, there's a lot of stuff in the book which was not there at all at the start when it was first being designed. Like originally it was just sort of that kind of, can you draw enough of the card of that suit? But all those things are just there to heighten those draws, right? So like every single rule that I've added in, they're all working towards making every single time you do an action just be really exciting and like really tense, and giving you loads of ways that you can play with the odds and keeping it really casino-y. So like, for example, the king, one of the playbooks, he can cheat. So, you know, if you succeed, he grabs one of those cards and puts it in his hand, and he can play it later. And, you know, like, what's that? You desperate for odds? Well, I've got one up my sleeve, you know? That's a really fun thing. And just, like, playing with the odds. And, you know, the Jack is able to just fail less often. Like, they are just really lucky. Like, they get to draw 5 cards before they fail instead of 4, you know? Like, there's loads of little things like that where it's, you know, the abilities are just as mechanically interesting as they are sort of, like, character-focused. So loads of stuff like that. I think this was supposed to be me describing how the game works in 5 minutes, but I went on a rant there. Sorry.
No, it's so good. I'm so here for it. No, the playbooks scream a lot of character in a lot of different ways, and they're easily colored by the type of suit that you sort of aim to emulate, right? Because you put a lot of nice prompting into the style of the suit in choice, between clubs being physical, hearts being social, and spades being clandestine in some manner. Clandestine? Is that the word?
Clandestine, I think. But
Clandestine.
I don't know if that's different, like, from America to the UK. So you might say that to someone in the US, and people will be like, "What the hell are you talking about?"
But those also inform a type of character playing. And just to sort of like circle back onto how the draw pile is managed narratively, I think is amazing, because I think I feel similarly to you that there are, you know, I'm attracted to partial success systems. So success has margin of success systems is what the real term is. And then I've been really like, I don't love pass fail, because there's always a middle ground. There's always nuance to whatever you're doing. Mm-hmm. And I love that the draw pile can sort of paint a story for you, right? So if it's a hearts challenge, you're trying to talk this person down. Maybe one of the failure cards is a club, right? There's easily like, if you really want to dive into the role play of that, and not just like shovel out the challenge cards until you find out whether you pass or fail, you could easily be like, okay, here's a hearts. We're having a conversation. He's really starting to let down his guard, but you throw up a clubs, and he was reminded why he has the gun at you in the first place. Maybe like pistol whips the hostage or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Like that sort of story can be told as cards are being revealed as well, which is very fascinating to me and something I constantly think about when I think about margin of success systems, especially as I think more and more about using decks of cards as resolution mechanics. So that's all very amazing. If anything, anyone who's listening, that right there is a perfect reason to get this game. It's just the case study of how that narrative prompting is presented in the game. And then also the weight of the real stakes in the stakes of like a game influenced by betting mechanics, right? Like saying like, ooh, I think that I can get one more. I think that the next one's gonna be a heart, right? Like you're thinking like, I could hit one more time. I'm at 14. I'm at 14. I could totally take another card here, right? You're pushing your luck in these instances, and while there are some mechanics to talk about pushing your luck and putting that stuff out there. Like when we talk about the helping mechanics and preparing for success or failure, those are really cool as well. But without even like saying, you know, you want to push your luck. There's not a mechanic that says push your luck and do X. And maybe there is on a playbook that I'm not remembering or something to that effect. But you're wanting to do that. You already have this intrinsicness with the themes of the game and the mechanics that are being presented that like, I could do one more card. I think we could do one more card before I decide to fold or not here. I could push it, right? And I also love that the face cards are representative of the characters, the picture cards as you talk about them in the book, this being the king, queen, jack. And how when those are represented by your playbook, your personal character, it's that same thing. Like how in the previous, I was talking about like maybe the clubs represents that he's getting a little bit more hostile, right? The Jack of Spades comes up. You've now exposed a friend, and it could be in any capacity in that narrative, right? It could be the friend who's right next to you that might take this bullet for you if things go bad, but it might also be like maybe you expose the sniper who's like waiting to take the shot, but you accidentally like motion to your earpiece or something like that, right? Now it's like, do you have someone watching me? And like that, the further failures of those cards are presented a new narrative in that moment. It's very cool that there's all this abstraction of narrative and prompting that is present from something just as simple as looking at the river of cards before you and telling that story, which I think is very powerful. So total triumph to you at the end of the day.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, that's something that like it's one of my favorite things about it. Like because there's a whole chapter called Interpreting a Fold, and it's like what does it mean when like you look at this run of cards and try and make sense of it? And something that like I don't want to put in the book because I don't want to make people think that this is something that they need to do because it's actually a really difficult skill. But if you're a really talented GM, you can do that stuff in real time. So like, you know, you draw a card and it's not one of the cards you need. And like you say, it's a club. Maybe you get a little bit aggressive and it does not work. Like you can see him like sort of putting his shoulders up and getting a little bit like affronted. So then maybe the next card that you draw is a club as well, and suddenly he starts returning that energy and he's like, oh, what, you think you're bigger than me? Like you think you can intimidate me? Like don't you see I'm holding the weapon? Then suddenly you draw that heart and you're just like, okay, well how does, you know, now you've succeeded after that tense moment, what does that mean? Maybe it's okay, like, you know, after you sort of like you slink back with your tail in your legs, it calms him down because it puts him back in power, and like because he's in control he doesn't feel threatened and like all that kind of thing. So whilst you can go back and you can sort of you can tell that story in reverse, and that's kind of like the way that it's meant to be played because it gives you a lot more options as well. Because you can kind of write yourself in a hole if you do it dangerously. But you know you can do that in real time, and it's like a tarot reading. You know, like you pull out this spread of cards, and it intrinsically gives you the building blocks to tell a story without you having to completely imagine every single part of it. And you can completely ignore it if you want. Like, you know, the GM is always like free to just tell the story however they like, but you know they don't have to do every single bit of the heavy lifting. You know, there's a lot of talk in RPGs about, oh, if you're a GM and you're struggling, like lean on your players because they're storytellers too, and that's great. But also, like, you know, the game's supposed to tell a story too as well, right? So you know, like there should be things in that system that give you prompts and give you like ideas that you can build off of, and they might not always be 100% relevant and you can ignore them if you need to, but like a lot of the time, because they've got that sort of abstract nature, it's a great inspiration for it, and it really sells like this tense moment. I always want challenges in Theodore to be like these big moments, right? You're not just, you know, you're not just trying to
give someone a compliment, giving someone a compliment is part of like this big action that you're trying to take. Like you are trying to convince someone to unlock a door for you, right? It's not just, hello, can you unlock the door for me? Yes. I say yes, because I rolled a 15.
I rolled a 25, yeah.
Yeah, I say yes, so therefore here's the door open. It's, how do you approach them? Do you walk up slyly, or are you like looking nonchalant, like you're about to walk through the door anyway? And maybe they say, "Excuse me, sir, this door is actually locked for a reason." What's your approach then? Do you then start saying, "Oh, actually, I'm supposed to be in here"? If that fails, so they say, "Oh, there's a list." What tactic do you take then? And that could just be like 15 different dice rolls all in a row. But not only do the odds then become like ridiculously against you, especially with D20 systems, but also just like, those individual sentences aren't the interesting bit unless they're part of like a grander action. So why not just combine them all into this big thing that's happening, To talk about John Harper again, Aegon is like a really, really smart system. It's, it's based on like Greek myth, and you do all of your dice rolling in advance and then you tell the story, because you look at the picture that the dice are telling. And it's like this person, failed the action, whereas this person did well, but this person succeeded and also did better than everyone else. So you tell that story in reverse order, where it's like, my hero, like, we're fighting a giant monster. My hero runs forth and tries to swing it with a sword, but like the monster just sort of sweeps me away. So then the next person takes over. It's like, okay, well, I come over to try and help you, and I sort of like grab my shield and block the blow, but it means that I can't fight. But then the next person who succeeded really well, it's like, well, cool, now you've distracted the monster. My character does this like epic leap and plants a spear in its head, and we all triumph, because that is just built there for you. You've got the building blocks to tell that story in the moment, and those are the interesting parts of the game. So like, let people revel in them. That's what I always say.
There's definitely something to be said about examining resolution systems that sort of teach you to play the game after the roll, not before the roll, right? So like I guess to elaborate on that is that when you think about D&D, you say, okay, I want to attack the orc with my great axe, right? Like you and everyone at the table has already imagined you as an adept fighter, right? Yep. To swing your axe and succeed at hitting this slow-moving brute of an opponent. And you roll the dice and you fail. And, in some cases, you might have a table that just whoopee cushions the whole thing. It's like, oh, you slip on a banana peel, or you didn't read like the sides of the room right, or even in the more serious cases, like, oh, he dodges or deflects you or something. But like you're hefting a huge, like the thing I'm trying to point to is that when you roll after the fact, after you've already had the narrative to find out whether you pass or fail, I think there's this loss that happen, like this deflation that happens for people at the table, where it's like, and I know the excitement comes from succeeding and getting those criticals and everything like that, but I think there's this deflation that happens. There's like, well, or I guess not, right? Like there's almost always that phrasing, right? Like I'm gonna hit the orc, roll it. Oh, I guess I don't hit the orc, right? Like you had to backpedal on what you thought was gonna happen. Whereas if you do sort of your roll first and see what you have available to you, right? And then you can say, okay, this is the story I want to spin with what I have. Like think about the opposite. Think about if you rolled that D20 at the start of your turn before you did anything, even if it was combat, like you're going to throw this great axe attack. You throw, it's like, oh, that's going to be 11. Okay, so I was going to do my attack action or whatever, or maybe you can do something that causes you to, it doesn't matter. But, you see that 11, you're like, oh, I know that's not going to hit. So me having the player agency will say, okay, I swing my great axe in a big horizontal sweep, and I think he like brings down the great club, puts it in the ground, and like forms this pillar that like just catches the great axe, right? You aren't deflated. You created that negative moment for yourself, or you had the potential to create that negative moment for yourself. Like, okay, I wanted to succeed, I didn't succeed, or I know I'm not going to succeed. It's the same thing in 10 Candles. You know that
you know
you're
what the
going
outcome
to,
is before you start, right? And
exactly.
It's like, it gives you that platform then to be way more creative and way more like part of the narrative that's actually forming, rather than trying to retrofit yourself into it. And that's exactly how the system works, exactly how Aegon works as well. Like, I was kind of already designing Theodore by the time that I played that for the first time, but when I played it, I was like, yes, love this. This is exactly the kind of stuff that I like. Where it's that
that sort of amble of knowing what's about to come, or at least having an idea of what's about to come, which gives you that sort of like more tools. And there's kind of like a binary there where like D&D's right on the opposite end of the scale, where it's you have no idea what's going to happen, but you establish that something's happened, and then you realize that actually no, that's not what happened. You failed, which makes you feel like an idiot, right? And it's like, you know, D&D is almost like a slapstick game sometimes, in the fact that you're like this ridiculously adept warrior who accidentally slipped on a banana peel, like you said. Like it feels like sort of a bit like dissonant with the story that's supposed to be told, because you're supposed to be this like level
epic
20
hero,
barbarian warrior.
yeah,
It's like, how the hell did I miss a skeleton, you know?
Exactly.
Whereas then with Aegon, you've got like the exact opposite, which is great with its own strengths, because you've got like the same system where it's like you're trying to do something, you either succeed or fail, but you already know whether or not you succeeded or failed. So it becomes a storytelling game in that moment where you know what you're trying to do. You just find the most interesting way of saying it. So Theodore, I think, sits in the middle, where it's like you've got the narrative tools to tell you what's happening as the successes and fails are being like established. And you can see, like, pardon me, as you're drawing those cards, you can see how the odds are shifting against you. And you can like read, oh God, this feels like it's going to be a failure, rather than just be like, oh, it's a fail. It's like, oh God, no, this is slipping away from me.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it's
you feel the change.
You feel the change, like you can see the odds change, and like even if you don't see the numbers, like you can like that's the thing about drawing cards. Like you're like you play a simple game like higher or lower. And you draw a 5 and you're like, oh God, like that's right in the middle. Like, you know, you have that moment where you're like, oh, that is exactly what I didn't want to draw. And then that is where you have that crisis of conscience of like, oh God, am I making a bad decision here? But then suddenly, whether or not you fail or succeed, they both still feel tense and interesting because you were prepared for failure. In fact, failure could have even been more likely. Which even then, in that sense, makes success even more exciting, because it's like, against all odds, you succeeded. And like you saw how difficult it was for you to do this, rather than having like a sort of vague idea of here's the number I need to hit. It was like, oh yeah, you drew 3 cards that did not go your way, and then all of a sudden everything came up trumps, right? And that's way more interesting for someone, even if they're like, you know, let's say you're trying to draw like 6 hearts in some, you're trying to shift like mountains. You're trying to draw 6 clubs or something, and you draw 3 cards in a row that are terrible, but then you draw club after club after club, and you're like 5 out of 6, but then you fail. And that moment is like, it's not, oh, you slipped, like, oh, something instantly happened. It's, oh God, you were so close. Like you were literally, you know, you're trying to stab someone, you had the blade like nicking their skin. Like you can see like that little tiny bit of crimson coming out of their cheek before they just push you aside. And like that is when you, like, if you're reading a novel or watching a film or listening to a podcast, those are the moments that stick with you, not that moment of like, I failed, or I sort of succeeded, or I succeeded. And like that's the most important thing to me about this system. Like the thing that I'm most proud of bringing out, that sort of like elongated, high tense, high risk, high reward system of just seeing every single little microcosm of what makes up an action and what makes that action interesting. And just knowing how much is at stake every time you draw one of those cards. And just a little quirky thing as well. One of my favorite sort of like moments of tension relief in that kind of system, because obviously that's like, there's a lot on people's shoulders when they're playing, because it's not a dice. Like, and this is a thing that I spoke about in a different podcast, but like cards are a static thing. So like, if you draw a card and then you decide not to, let's say you folded, right? And you're like, no, it's too rich for my blood. I'm going to fold. I'm going to take like a partial failure and sort of like, you know, cut my losses. As soon as you draw the next card from the deck, you know whether or not you made the right decision. Because like the next person takes a challenge and you see the heart you were looking for and you're like, oh no, I can't believe I folded.
Or
that's
amazing.
You know, you see a character card that would have failed and killed the character. You're like, oh God, I'm glad I folded.
Saved
you know,
my
like,
life. And you could, and again, like that challenge to challenge, as we were talking about with the sort of the narrative prompting, that river of story, right? That even that example is like, you could still fold that into the last thing you just folded, right? Or failure or success, right? Like, at least like the GM could spin in like, oh, and you pop up one of your teammates, the sniper's face card, right? In the next challenge, like, at least you didn't let on that someone was watching him, right? Like that whole, like you could still add on to that whole thing. It's very cool how it all connects together for sure. And there's also, I don't know if you've considered this, but I feel like there's an energy of like a solo version in here. Like I feel like there's sort of like solo play energy inside of this.
There's definitely something that I had thought about. I've had people ask me like, is this something I can play on my own? I'm like, it's definitely not as it stands, but like there is absolutely something there, and it might be something that I come back to. I will probably like work on some other things and then come back to it, I think, rather than being like, okay, now we make it a solo game, because I think I'd lose my mind. But yeah, there's absolutely something there, because it shares a lot of those, like you can, I've spoken about a lot of games, and like I will, whilst I would love to make a ludography in the book and be like, these are all the games that directly inspired me, it's difficult to say this is the exact thing, this is the exact thing. Like the way that the suits work and how they're not necessarily like prescriptive, they're just descriptive. Like that comes from like lasers and feelings, in the way that, is this action lasers or feelings, which is like the central question of that game. Like whenever you do something, it's like, are you doing it with lasers, like are you cold and calculated, or are you doing it with feelings, are you like rash and like working on instinct? That's how those suits work. So like, let's say that you want to convince someone to do something, you're like, I want you to, I keep talking about hearts challenges actually, let's say that you want to hack into a computer system, right? Like, are you doing it with like prior knowledge that you're drawing upon, and like exactly the line of code that you need to write in that will break their systems apart? Are you doing it so that you don't leave a trace, and like, are you going in through like back passages so that like you're going into parts of the system that people didn't even really know existed? Are you just like brute forcing and like DDoSing the thing, and just like you're leaving your fingerprints all over it, but like you're getting what you want? Like those are all different like ways of doing the same thing, and like in order, that was hearts, spades, and clubs, right? So those actions are just like in lasers and feelings. They are a feeling that you're having when you're doing that action, not like, if you are doing stealth, then you are doing a spade action. It's like you are, it's the essence of spades, rather than just like a list of things that you can do with it.
Yeah, they're more adjective than verb. You're putting the verb out there, and you're saying like, I want to engage with this martini glass stealthily, right? Like whatever that happens to be, but it's more a layer on top of, rather than the instigator for the engagement.
Yeah, 100%. Like you can imagine like, hey, I want to beat this person up. It's like, oh, okay, that's a clubs action. It's like, well, maybe clubs would be the most like effective way of doing that. Like I'm sure you can pummel them into the ground with clubs, or like you can completely like wrestle them onto the floor. But maybe actually you go with spades, and maybe you're doing more of a like swift, and like you're hitting them with multiple hits, and you're ducking and weaving, and all that kind of stuff. Or maybe you're doing it with hearts, where you're reading. It's that scene from the Sherlock Holmes film where you're seeing like every single like angle, and you're reading the mathematical like exact angle where if you punch him in the chin, he'll get knocked out in one blow, kind of thing. Whereas everything can be done in so many different ways, and that was something that I wanted to make sure. So that there's like a whole paragraph of like, hey, don't think that this action can only be done by these people, because look, this can be tackled in so many different ways. And yeah, there's loads of things like that. We tried to make it super example heavy, and be very much giving people as much information as needed. But also like, I think the final book, and do you know what? I'm going to get the page number for you, like just to be 100%. I think it's only like 100 pages or something like that.
Yeah.
Like it's super slimline. So like because I know we've spoken about like how many different things there are in the book. Like this is not a long read. Like we've tried to trim it down into the like thinnest, like lightest possible system we can. Like it's very beginner friendly, as long as you've got an experienced GM with you. Like players will not, I don't think, have a problem sort of learning the rules. Like you can teach people as you play. Like it's very much a system that draws on a lot of knowledge that a lot of people already have as well. So like not to scare people off with the inside baseball we've been talking about.
Yeah, 60 batting average. You know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, it is in the like 100 pages here, and as I now understand the game, like if I were to run this, I don't think it's something you could definitely do as moving along. Like you could really just put the deck down, set the deck up, and then say, let's go, let's play. Who do you want to be, right? Like grab your face card and let's just rock and roll. And then it could really be I think the real charm from the mastery of the game definitely comes from learning to flex on the adjectives that are the descriptive suits, right? Because like you said, initially someone who may be less verbose in role playing might think I always have to clubs as clubs, right? Like you always have to engage in the fight with the fight. But that's not necessarily true. You could spin the story however you want. I just declare what the challenge is, right? I might even say like, oh, you want to engage with this guy, but you don't want to bring attention to yourself. This is a spades challenge. You know what I mean? Like you're trying to not draw attention to you or him. So they're like, well, wait, why would I do it that? Well, because you don't want anyone to notice you. Do you want to have everyone notice you? You can clubs it. You know what I mean? Like that's the conversation that happens in that moment.
And it's like, yeah, sure. Like you can approach it from the suit that benefits you the most as well all the time, right? It's like,
Absolutely.
well, if I'm a clubs character, why don't I just do everything like a clubs character would? And it's like, yeah, sure, you have the best modifier for clubs, but that doesn't mean that doing everything like a club is going to be the easiest way to do things. So like, trying to smooth talk like, Buckingham Palace guard who has trained his entire life to not look at anyone and never react is going to be way more difficult than it is to just sort of like slip something out of his pocket or something like that, and like there are multiple ways to achieve certain objectives, but that doesn't mean that they're all equal. Doesn't mean that they're all as easy as each other. Doesn't mean that they're all going to be quite as forgiving as you fail, quite as available. Yeah. Like, I mean, if you fail to charm someone, they might just scoff and walk away. If you fail to intimidate someone, you might get yourself in a fight, Like they have very, very different implications. So there's still definitely an equation you have to do in your head of like, should I be doing clubs right now? I know it's the best suit for me, but like, should I? So like, if you're sitting here and thinking, oh, well, I'll just always do the same action, like there's definitely things that you need to consider. And like a lot of that will be the GM, of course. And like, that's why I would say that GMing this game is not necessarily the easiest for a new player, but for playing, absolutely, I think like it's definitely beginner friendly.
And there's also like the availability is what I was really trying to point to, because like I think some people who might listen be like, oh, so then why don't I just clubs all the time? Well, once you get into the rule more specifically of the game and learn that like some cards get taken out of the deck or there's the discard pile, right? You could still abstractly or narratively fictionally position everything as like, oh, you don't have a lot of clubs in the decks. Like there's no fighting option at this party. Like you don't have it available to you. There's too much security around. You don't have the clubs cards in the deck. I know you want to engage clubs with clubs, but like it's just not possible. The deck says no, and it's where it's tying back into what you're saying about how the game also has a story to tell, right? Like the GM is there, the players are there, and then the mechanics of the game are also helping to tell. Like I think there's something really interesting or sparking here to consider, like the game also, like in game design moving forward in a modern space. I think there's something to consider about the game also being a player, and it is providing you questions and tools. It's like your co-GM. Like consider the game mechanics as a co-GM helping you delineate abstractive thought into a malleable thought space, imagination space, right?
Yeah, and this is 100% a game that tries to do that, like it's, like, for example, you talk about how cards can leave that deck and leave you in a different position, and how the odds around you can change both in the world and in the mechanics. Like that deck, it's called the opportunity deck, because it's like, it is an abstract representation of all the things that you need to go right for you suddenly dropping away as cards get discarded and taken out the game and things. It's like, sure, you might have had equal opportunity to go in guns blazing or to try and smooth talk your way through this party at the start of the game, but things have changed since the game started. Like the odds have slipped into a different space, and like if all of those clubs are gone, like maybe the fight's just not in you anymore. Maybe, like you said, like it's way too dangerous for you to be picking fights. There's too many guards, there's too many security systems. Maybe, they just outman you, outgun you, outsmart you. Like maybe every time that you try to be intimidating, you've just not got it. You've just not got the social credibility to intimidate anyone here. Like, you're walking up to people that are just not scared by you because you've used up that tactic. Especially if someone, if you've been walking around trying to intimidate everyone you see, suddenly people are going to see all those failures that you had and think, I'm not sure you're very intimidating, actually. So there are ways where you can interpret those odds as well, and like you say, and just be like, well, okay, so we've run out of hearts, and until we reshuffle the deck, we're not going to get any more. So we've got a hiatus here where, like, playing as a heart just isn't going to work. Mm-hmm. Why is that? What's happened? Yeah. And the players can think about that just as much as the GM, and they can be like, oh god, I can't use my hearts. Like, I've been trying to use hearts this whole game, but like I've used up all my opportunities. Like, why is my character now having to do stuff that he's not as familiar with or as comfortable with? Like, what's forcing them into that position? Why is that interesting as a character, and why do I want to play in that space?
And you also get the availability of the opposite too. Like, you're able to, there's this, I mean, obviously I say that, I think everyone could figure out where I was going to go at that point, but I think the whole kit and caboodle of what I've been saying here in awe of this game is that the house doesn't always win because you're constantly playing the odds, and you're trying to play the odds in your favor, right? Like, there's additional like slogan tagline here where, like, this game is really effective at having you think about playing against and with the narrative in a lot of cool ways, and it executes on so many levels of complexity that I think, like, this is definitely something to be examined in the future for anyone. Like, once the game is released, is what I mean. Like, there's definitely no reason you shouldn't check out this game and really absorb what it has to say. I think that you and the team have done a splendid job in creating something very visceral in a great way.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, no, and as you say, big shout out to all the people I've been working with as well, because, like, especially Lauren McManaman, who worked on, I always say the name of this game wrong, so I'm just gonna check what it's called. Good Society, the Jane Austen role-playing game. I always call it High Society, which is the card game. But yeah, so Lauren worked on that. Lauren's worked on a few things. She is an incredibly good editor. And just, like, there have been so many times where she's read through a paragraph that I've tried to convey, and she's just asked me that one question that's just made me go, oh god, why have I never thought of that? Like, why have I never asked myself that question? And it's like, yeah, I can't recommend working with her enough. Like, she's been absolutely fantastic. And like the visual side of the game, like Tom Hutchings is the graphic designer who's, worked on the cover and has been like a sort of de facto kind of like art lead with me and just making sure everyone's like getting together. Like, it looks beautiful. It looks absolutely beautiful.
So good.
Like, even if you just want something to put on your table, like, grab this thing. It looks so nice. Like, I'm so pleased with it. I can't wait to hold it in my hand. Like, I've never really made something physical that I can be like, whoa, this is mine. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting it printed. But, yeah, so massive shout-outs to all the people who worked on this game. Like, don't let me take all the credit. I know that it's, I made the game, yes. I will be nice to myself for 1 second. Yeah, okay, I did make the game. But, yeah, it's definitely way better than it ever would have been if I would.
So the last segment of this show, because you already did sort of the tip in the beginning, but it'll be trends, Wheels. So at some portion of the show, this being that portion, I ask if there are any trends that you've seen in your communities, your social media, whatever have you, that you really like are moving the game design space forward. Maybe you want to point to a trend that's detractful that you think people should be aware of or be cautious of. And if there are any trends within you that you want to speak into the ether to sort of start to culminate or snowball that you would like to see games explore more.
I think to bring it all back to like the first thing that we talked about, like board games and RPGs are a match made in heaven, and nobody seems to be able to see that for what it is, and like you're doing yourself a disservice. So, for example, like there's a RPG system that's been going around for ages called Dread. It's a great game. If you've not heard of it, I can pitch you to it in like 10 seconds, okay? It's a horror game where instead of rolling dice to do things, you take a block out of a Jenga tower. Like, immediately think about all the narrative tension and physical tension that makes, where your actual trembling hands might kill your character. Think about that. There was an RPG that went around with the Ennies, I think it won an award, which is like a sort of, sorry, I don't know the designer or the name of the game, but it's like a zombie apocalypse kind of game, and it uses hidden role mechanics from board games. So like it uses, there's a board game called Who Goes There, which is like, you know, what the thing's based on, where every time you get like bitten or whatever, you draw from like a deck of cards, and every card but one is blank, and the one that isn't blank means that you're infected, and nobody around you in the group of RPG players that you're playing with knows if you're infected or not, because it's that thing of like, oh god, I don't want them to know that I've been bitten because they might kill me. So that's a really interesting thing, and that really blows things open. Or Sleepaway also is using like hidden role mechanics, like everyone closes their eyes while someone beats the monster for a bit. There's so many cool things. Like I was literally like, I think yesterday, so I was on Twitter and I saw the most recent thing that Adira Slattery posted, which is about this sort of like amazing, like wacky, like car-based apocalypse thing. Like it looks amazing. And there were 3 words that were in that tweet. I mean, 2 words even, that got me so incredibly excited. And I think I may have misread it, which may make it less exciting than it should be, but maybe you should make this game at home. She described it as a Yahtzee hack. And like, imagine that, right? Imagine an RPG that's built on Yahtzee, right? Or, you know, I've been toying with this idea ever since I got this tarot deck of like making an RPG where it's a roll and move. You know, like you're going around a bloody Monopoly board or something, and like depending on where you end up is going to tell you what happens for like solo RPGs and stuff like that. There are just so many brilliant ideas that have either been around for decades or are being invented every single day in the board game space. And if you look at RPGs, like you look at some of the indie titles that are starting to take those on now, and they're just so exciting. Like not everything has to be about prompts and dice, you know, like there are so many different ways that you can elicit storytelling from people through mechanics. I hope that like I've made an interesting one that people will be into. Like that's definitely something that I wanted to push when I was making that game. And that is something that I'm just going to be doing with every game that I ever make. You know, like one thing that I've always said is if I'm making a game and it's not at least trying to innovate, like I feel like I'm wasting my time making it almost. And that's that's a personal thing that I have. It's not a thing that I think every single person should subscribe to, because also like some people just want to make things for fun. Like it doesn't have to change the world or anything, but like I always want to be innovating, always want to try and make something that's new and that hasn't been tried before, because otherwise I'll just go play like the game that's done it before by people who are probably more creative and talented than me, you know, like I'll just go enjoy their work rather than like old Muggins here doing it. So there you go.
Yeah, there is definitely something, like we've already said, something to be learned from board games. And I really think, you know, I think about games like Betrayal and the House on the Hill, that board game. I think about like social deduction games like Mafia or Werewolf or even Blood on the Clock Tower. Those all have like subtle role-playing mechanisms within them without being strictly like this is a role-playing game, but you sort of are taking on a role. There's like this very thin veil, at least for the games that I've been exposed to, there's this very thin veil of if someone were to just like pop the plastic and rip it open, there could be this very cool blending that could happen out of nowhere. And it just takes someone to want to take that pointy bit and do it. You know,
I mean, look, we were talking about tactical RPGs earlier, right? Have you ever played the Arkham Horror card game?
No, but I've seen it several times. I'm
playing it with my partner at the moment. It's fantastic. Like I've evangelized it all the time. Like I've just been like, play this game. It's so good. But like I've never gotten like one of the proper expansion campaigns and played all the way through it. We've just started playing it. I'm having such a good time, and it does so many interesting things with like the abstraction of like movement and stuff like that. And I look at that game and I think you could make an incredible tactical RPG out of this, like the way that it uses card play and stuff like that. I mean, there's, you know, we talked about miniatures games as well. Like most people just look at that and think, oh, okay, moving amounts of inches and doing a certain amount of damage with dice. That's not the most interesting thing that miniatures do. Like there's a game called Malifaux, which uses like some of the card mechanics that I've been talking about, where you could hold a hand of cards that are cheating. And it's like, you know, what if you go through your classic game of D&D and you're rolling your D20 every time, but 3 times throughout the entire campaign, you have a chance to turn it on its head and turn it into a crit success. Like, when do you deploy that nuclear missile? Like, when do you think, oh God, this is my one chance to use this, and if I run out, like, you know, I might end up regretting it. Like, that's a great decision to have held over your head throughout the whole game. Like, so many interesting things that you can take from all kinds of other periods of game design, and like, go out there, find them, like, see what interests you, steal the ideas. Like, that's art. Great art is steal. Like, that's the phrase. Like, because, you know, everyone is like basing something off of something else that they like. Like, that's what creatives do. They look at something that interests them and they're like, oh, I'd love to make a game about that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. What if this?
Yeah, what if this? Like, what if is the most powerful tool we have as game designers. So, like, look at something that excites you and think, wow, what if we did this but in a completely different space or a completely different genre? Think about how many games there are out there in the board game space that are trying to recreate the D&D experience.
Yep.
And tell me that not a single one of them has ever had a good idea. Like,
yeah.
like, tell me that not a single one of them it's worth looking at and thinking, oh, actually, if you added this into D&D, it actually would be really interesting to use. Like, just go out there, explore, like, think about stuff that really excites you. Think about things that you've never thought about in an RPG context, and think about what that would be like if you actually flipped it around. Because I guarantee you'll find something exciting.
Yeah, another case study I just want to mention to add on the table of all these games is I've actually played Time Stories. I played a couple versions of Time Stories.
Time Stories is great.
It's definitely, like, I think wholesale is an RPG board game. I think again it leans more heavily in the RPG spectrum of that board game play, and still has like that veil that it's almost just like not there. But yeah, I think it's also an excellent case study for a game that like focuses on the role play while instigating on board game mechanics using cards and rooms and a play mat and everything to that effect. There's also a game called Cobwebs by Adam Vass and Will Yopes that also instigates a lot of like horror themes, has you play on a board game, but is also a role-playing hybrid. So they are also looking at those sorts of spaces and trying to push on everything until something comes out the other end of the creation machine.
Yeah, like, I mean, there's a game called, I think it's called Nyctophobia, where like the players are blindfolded and they have to like feel their way around the board and stuff like that. Like, imagine that in a horror setting. Like, imagine like you could do genuine jump scares because you're blindfolded, you don't know what's going on, and then you feel the GM touch your hand and you're like, oh god, like what's that? You know, there's so many things you can do with that. Or like, I think about Time Stories and I think about how, like, so Time Stories has this sort of like Groundhog Day like vibe to it, where it's you go through the exact same thing over and over again trying to do the perfect version of it. Imagine that in an RPG space. What if you're doing like your generic, oh hey, go to this bandit camp and kill the bandit leader or whatever, but you have to do it like over and over again and explore it in a different way, and like you've got that kind of roguelike element that you get from video games and stuff like that. Like, what does a roguelike video game look like as a tabletop RPG? Like, everything that excites me the most in new RPGs that are innovating, like, are ones that have looked outside of the space and thought, wow, whatever that is that they're doing that's really interesting, I want to try it myself, but I'm not going to do it in their medium, I'm going to do it in mine. Exactly. Hack things that aren't RPGs, basically. Like, go out and find things that shouldn't work for RPG spaces, but will, because you will make them.
Yeah. You'll figure it out.
I believe in you.
Great. Amazing. Perfect. This is such a good episode, and I'm gonna have to break it up into 2 parts, but it's worth every minute. Wheels, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on Draw Your Dice. Thank you so much for being here. For this last little bit, why don't you again give a plug about who you are, what you do, where they can find all of your stuff. All these links that Wheels is about to share with us will be in the show notes down below for your access.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been an incredible couple of hours talking. Like, I honestly, it is 20 to 12 here, like in the PM, and I could keep going until like 2 a.m. if you let me. So if you want to find my games, go over to wheelsrpgs.com. So that's wheels like you would find on a bus, and then rpgs.com. If you put a /THDAW, so Theodore, on the end of that, you'll find The House Doesn't Always Win. There is also, I will say, there is like a subsection of that page called Members of the House, which I briefly spoke about earlier, just like Forged in the Dark or Powered by the Apocalypse or anything like that. I want people to, like, if they like these mechanics, I want people to make games out of them. Like, I want to see what your creations are. There's a contact form where you can get in touch, and I'll give you official permission to put my logo on it and all that kind of stuff. And there's even a program where if you're a game designer from a marginalized background and you want a free copy of the game, let me know. I'll send it to you. I want to see what you make with it. So that's all my RPG stuff. If you want to watch me be stupid on the internet, go on over to twitch.tv/Wheels, where I do video games. And of course, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, every single week of the foreseeable future, I will be making content for dicebreaker.com, where we talk about all sorts of stuff like this. We've got our own podcast as well. I mean, Jeremy, you should probably come on and guest. That would be really nice. Yeah, no, I see that.
I will.
Absolutely. We do live streams. We do like painting streams where you can just sit with us and we'll paint miniatures together, and that's nice. We do Let's Plays. I do big lists of like, you know, games to recommend. So like the most recent one we did is, hey, you like digital card games like Hearthstone? Here are 5 games that are amazing but aren't Hearthstone. Like, you know, try something different. Here's, you know, one of our most popular videos, Shock Horror, is 10 games that are RPGs but aren't Dungeons and Dragons. So there's all sorts of stuff like that. Like if you're brand new to tabletop gaming in general, we have got all sorts of recommendations for you, and we are like built from the ground up to be the most accessible platform for people who are new to the games in the world, hopefully. Like we have tried to take every single step to be, if you were to never have heard of what the hell a board game or a tabletop RPG is, and you wound up on dicebreaker.com, you would feel like there was like an easy path for you to get involved in the hobby and understand what's going on. Like that's always been our message from day one. If it feels like we're not doing that, ping me an email and I will fix it. But yeah,
hit me up real quick, like.
But yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's been an absolute blast. You can find me on Twitter as well, Cube Whelan, KUBEWHELAN. I should really format all of my things so that they're the same stuff. But yeah, I'm on Twitter doing stupid stuff as well and crap posting. There we go. We haven't sworn throughout the entire video, so I should, or podcast rather. I should probably keep it stum. There you go. Thank you very much for having me, man. It's been such a good time. Thank you.
Aw. Well, everyone, that brings us to the end of the show. I hope that you had a good time listening to Wheels, because I absolutely did and learned a lot. So we will catch you next time. Say bye to the people, Wheels.
See you later. Bye.
Bye. All right, that's a wrap. You can really feel the love for gaming from Wheels. So pure, and I wish the best of luck to Wheels and all members of the team in the coming future. All the games we talked about today, along with all the links to get in touch with Wheels, as well as a link to the Kickstarter for Theodore, will be down below in the show notes for your access. If you liked the show and found it helpful, send a tip my way by following the link tree in the show notes to my Ko-fi or Venmo profiles. Or, if you are unable to provide monetary support, you can provide support at no cost by sharing this with someone you thought of while listening to this episode and leaving a review. Both of these methods greatly impact the success of this show and lets me know that what I'm doing is beneficial to designers out there. If you want to be a part of the conversation or hang out with the alumni from the show like Wheels, you can also join the DYD House Discord server. Thanks for listening, and I will catch you next time.